Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's event. Every year the Washington Institute has a book prize competition where we have a series of, or a group of jurors read dozens of books that have come out in the previous year. And we judge the finest books on Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And annually, for the last number of years, we've really enjoyed the process of being able to identify books that we think leaders, scholars, experts, government officials, journalists, diplomats should read if they want to understand the Middle East. There's only one problem with the Washington Institute Book Prize, which is it's not fair. We can't award prizes to our own scholars, to our own fellows. And we, especially today's author that we're recognizing with his book, we, some of us at least, write great books. Eric has written a great book. A book that draws on great firsthand research, his own on-the-ground work in Egypt, his own detailed interviews of a broad range of people deep inside the Muslim Brotherhood, deep inside the Egyptian state, deep inside American foreign policy hierarchy dealing with Egypt, to help understand what really is a fascinating question. How is it that after decades of laboring in the trenches, the Muslim Brotherhood rose to power in Egypt and then so spectacularly and so quickly lost power in Egypt? It is really both the rise and the fall, telling both these stories. That's what makes this book, fascinating name, Arab Fall, how the Muslim Brotherhood won and lost Egypt in exactly 891 days, what makes this such a fascinating story. And which is why we at the Institute were so proud of Eric for pursuing this, and proud that we could assist in the publication of this, along, of course, with Georgetown University Press, and to host Eric as our Esther K. Wagner Fellow. Today, we're especially delighted that Eric is joined for today's program with two people who have watched this process from the inside out, know it deeply and personally, and with great professionalism have explained it. One from the role of a former U.S. government official, deeply immersed in the events and the affairs of Egypt, explaining it here in the Washington policy context, and another from the role of an on-the-ground journalist who followed this through her day-to-day reporting, incisive analysis of what is going on inside Egypt. Two fascinating perspectives, both of which complement Eric's own work, and I think we're in for a really unique, what I would call a master's seminar in trying to understand the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, this is not just a historical exercise, I think it's fair to say. Whatever occurred in this 891 days is not merely a closed chapter of Egypt's political history, nor is it a closed chapter in the broader history of where the Middle East is going. The Muslim Brotherhood and other like-minded groups and organizations remain. They remain parts of the Egyptian political fabric, and they remain important actors in countries elsewhere in the Middle East. So lessons that can be drawn from the 891 days that we're going to be talking about today continue to have resonance and relevance in Egypt and beyond Egypt. And that's another reason why we're keen to support this sort of research, to support these sorts of books, and delighted to host today's event. I'm very delighted in just a moment, to welcome Eric to the podium. I want to take a moment now to welcome the panelists that will be joining Eric. As I mentioned, at the far end of the panel is Nancy Youssef. Nancy currently works as senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. A long career with McClatchy, Knight Ridder, and other media outlets. She has reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Jordan, and of course here in Washington. She'll be heading back shortly to the Middle East. I'm really delighted that she could fit us into her schedule and bring her expertise to this discussion. Sitting in between Nancy and Eric is Michele Dunne. Michele, of course, is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She previously was in the National Security Council and the State Department. Of course, at the founding director of the Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council. Michele has been intimately involved in policy toward Egypt, both in and out of government, and brings a very special perspective on the subject of today's discussion. So I'm really delighted to have all of you here. First turn to Eric, and then to our other panelists. Eric, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and I just want to start by saying what an honor and a pleasure it is to share the podium today and get some feedback from Michele and Nancy. Unfortunately, it's also apparently when we announced that I will not be winning the Washington Institute Book Prize. So some good news and some bad news. Really, thank you very much for coming. I want to start by just thinking back to an event that I think I certainly watched very closely. Maybe some of you watched very closely on TV. January 23rd, 2011. That was the day that the Jets lost to the Steelers in the AFC Championship game. I was in Cairo. I was a PhD student writing a dissertation on Egyptian opposition parties, not just on the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. Looked at the Dagamu Party, the WAFT, the Ghad Party, both factions, some of the youth activists. I'd interviewed a man named Mohamed Morsi. Anyway, Jets lost at roughly 4 a.m. on the 24th Cairo time. 5 hours later, I had a meeting just outside of Cairo with the former Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mehdi Akef, and January 24th, 2011, a few days in dissertation research. It's a pretty busy day. I had about five interviews that day. We had been hearing and, seen some activity about protests that were planned for the following day, January 25th, 2011, Police Day in Egypt. Those of you who have followed Egypt for many years will recall that this was hardly the first time that activists had called for protests against the Mubarak government. And, I frankly, and I think most Egyptians and probably even most of the activists weren't really sure what would happen. So my last meeting on January 24th, 2011 was with an opposition party leader, and he was a former parliamentarian, and I said to him, is tomorrow real? Is this really going to happen? Are there really going to be protests? He said, yes. I said, okay, where do I stand? He said, go to the High Court tomorrow at 1 p.m. So at roughly 1:20 p.m., you got to remember this is an ancient country, 20 minutes, not a big deal. Roughly 1:20 p.m., protests start gathering on the steps of the court, at the journalist syndicate, at the lawyer syndicate. Those of you who know downtown Cairo know that these are right around the corner from each other. They're contained by police forces. I'm following this, by the way, with my roommate, an Egyptian. His name's Hani. And all of a sudden, we noticed a few hundred people stream into this area that's roughly a mile north of Tahrir Square from the north. And they overwhelm the police at all these sites. The three small protests that I described converge, become a snowball, basically, more and more people deciding to join, push past successive lines of police, and ultimately take Tahrir Square. It was an amazing moment, honestly. As an American, it hit every myth that I think I and probably most Americans want to believe about the world, that people fundamentally yearn for freedom. And watching people march against a dictator is something that I will never forget, and I feel frankly honored to have been able to witness. But of course, it didn't end there. Later that day, things got a little bit tense on Qasr al-Aini Street, those of you who know downtown Cairo. And the protesters tried to take the prime minister's office. I ducked off to Hussein Higazi Street. I happen to know that street because I lived on there, on that street for roughly a year. And I turned to Hanny, my roommate, and I said, I'm getting out of here. I've had enough. And I said, you do what you got to do. This is your revolution, but I'm out. And he said, can I have your camera? I said, sure. So I gave him my camera. Anyway, about 20 minutes, half hour later, I get a call from Hanny. He's in the back of a police car. He had been photographing some protesters. He was beaten. He was arrested. Thankfully, he was released the following morning. I share this story because the Arab Spring was depicted, I think, for many of those who didn't witness it firsthand, as the first thing I described, that very inspiring, and it absolutely was, moment in which people were marching for freedom and dignity. It was also very terrifying. It was also a power struggle. It was also a series of repressions that, bred all sorts of political and societal instability. That's what happens with uprisings, and that's what happens with revolutions. Just to cap my January 2011 story, 3 days later, I was again in downtown Cairo for what became known as Friday of Rage. Downtown Cairo was blanketed with tear gas. Spent a lot of that day running. The next few nights, I was living in Doi at the time. There were shots heard across the neighborhood, and I evacuated with the State Department a couple days later returned to continue the research. When we think about that 2011 uprising, and we think about the factors that led to it, what we'll typically discuss is the calcified politics of the Mubarak era. People's search for dignity after living under a certain type of regime for 30 years. A stultifying economy, a lack of economic distribution, high youth unemployment, lack of opportunity. If you fast forward today, almost 6 years later, you could argue that actually all of those things are worse. Egypt today is more repressive. The economy today is in worse shape. Inflation has skyrocketed to the point that the latest information, which we were talking about just before this, is that on the black market, the pound is selling at 16 to the dollar. In this book, from the Morsi era, I'm talking about 7 to the dollar, 8 to 9 on the black market. Things are worse. And yet, the last 3 years has been, relative to the post-Arab Spring standards, a period of relative political quiet. Why is that? Why is that, despite the fact that in many ways conditions are worse, things have been, I'm not saying they'll continue this way necessarily, maybe, maybe not, but they have been quiet. To understand that, that's the story that I tell in this book. To understand what has been, at least until now, a lack of enthusiasm for a next uprising, it's important to understand what happened, at least in the minds of many Egyptians, during those 2011 to 2013 years. And what happened is pretty straightforward. The political forces that could come together against the dictator, against Mubarak, once he fell, were deeply divided. Some of them were leftists, some of them were communists, some of them were socialists, some of them were what you might call liberals, but small number. Many of them were Islamists, and Islamists running a wide range. And in that kind of environment where they were deeply divided, plus without any real political organization in most cases, there was only one organization that could seize the momentum and quickly rise to power, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood. And to understand that, you just need to understand two basic facts about the Muslim Brotherhood that really set it apart from any other political organization in Egypt. The first is, unlike the Waft Party, unlike April 6th Youth, unlike a lot of these organizations, becoming a Muslim brother is a very long and rigorous process. You don't simply go to the DMV and join the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a 5 to 8 year process. To become a Muslim brother, you ascend through multiple ranks. As you rise through the ranks, you're tested on your commitment to the organization and its cause. If you're the kind of person that asks too many questions, if you disagree too openly, they will demote you, they will investigate you, they will throw you out. By the end of this process, in most cases, you swear an oath to listen and obey. And these deeply committed members, and it takes roughly 5 to 8 years, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, but roughly 5 to 8 years to become a full-fledged Muslim brother, are then organized in a nationwide chain of command in which cells of roughly 5 to 10 people who are scattered throughout the country, known as usr, or families, answer to the commands of a central leadership known as the Guidance Office located in Cairo. So they have a deeply committed membership, and they're extremely well organized. And this serves a very specific ideological purpose. And by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't hide this. There's this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood presents one image to the West and one image locally. Not in my experience. Actually, the reason I know this is because I did interviews with Muslim brothers who were quite open about this. The reason why the Muslim Brotherhood is structured this way is because they have a very long-term plan that was sketched out by Hassan al-Banna starting in 1928 up through his death in 1949, his assassination, but which Khayrat al-Shatter, the Deputy Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, repeated quite openly when he was released from prison after the uprising in 2011. That plan is they want to Islamize first the individual through their organization. They want to build families around their particular politicized interpretation of Islam that will then spread their particular message in the society until it attains enough support so that they win political power. And when this happens in multiple countries around the world, and this could take a very, very long time, there's no set time frame, they hope to establish a global Islamic state. How do they interpret Islam? They interpret Islam as an all-encompassing concept meant to guide every aspect of life. What is that all-encompassing concept? And here's where things get a little dicey. Well, in truth, they don't have a very specific vision. One of the shocks for me in interviewing Muslim brothers was that when you would ask them, all right, now that you're in power and you've spoken about implementing the Sharia, what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of an education policy, a healthcare policy, a tax policy, a foreign policy? Give me something. And they had nothing. And for them, the interpretation of Islam was what they said it was. And so when you have an organization that is built in a fundamentally totalitarian fashion, and that seeks to empower itself according to it and only its interpretation of Islam, and it's vague on it to the extent that what it says is Islam, well, in a Muslim majority society, that can be highly alienating. And so while the Muslim Brotherhood was structured in such a way that it was able to rise to power very quickly, once it was in power, it was aimless, it was divisive, it was autocratic, it alienated the population very, very quickly. And most troubling for the Muslim Brotherhood, in my view, it didn't recognize this. It couldn't see it. You know, if you talk to former Morsi advisors, as I had in researching the book, some of them had some inkling that, you know, there might be an uprising and Morsi might be ousted by the military. But Muslim brothers who were at Rabaa, initially protesting in support of Morsi, then, of course, opposing the coup, never saw it coming. They believed, because they're such an insular organization, that Morsi would survive. And that left them very ill-prepared for the period to come. So why is an uprising, or why has an uprising not happened at all these last 3 years? It's because the experience of Egypt's first elected government, the Morsi government, left a very bad taste in many Egyptians' mouth. I mean, this was an experiment that followed Mubarak's ouster, and the failure of that democratic experiment, for many Egyptians, and I don't mean all, and I don't mean it can't happen again, but for many Egyptians, delegitimized that type of political process. Again, history is long, things can change, but that's why it's been relatively politically quiet, not quiet on other fronts, these past 3 years. I want to very briefly address the policy debate on this. My view in this book and in general is that the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood is very much an Egyptian story. It's a story that really goes according to the internal political dynamics of Egypt. And in this book, I dig pretty deeply into them. And I explain the sort of legal, constitutional, political considerations that drove the Muslim Brotherhood's behavior according to my research and my interviews with Muslim brothers. But the U.S. did play a role. My argument in this book is not that, the U.S. supported the Brotherhood or helped the Brotherhood rise. My view basically is that the Brotherhood was inevitably going to rise. I certainly wouldn't have expected that it would have fallen as quickly as it did, but that's an Egyptian story. Where the U.S. comes in is the extent to which, by embracing the Brotherhood, by trying to engage the Brotherhood in a very friendly and unconditional manner, the Brotherhood no longer factored how the U.S. might respond into its calculations. The Muslim Brotherhood is a fundamentally, anti-Western organization. What it's trying to do is revive the Islamic world by resisting what it views as foreign influences. And that's why it expected that the U.S. and the West would be the primary barrier to its emergence. Look, it expected this, I think incorrectly, but had the U.S. taken a more skeptical approach, had the U.S. conditioned its engagement, or at least the extent of its engagement, on the Muslim Brotherhood making some type of concession, whether it would be on foreign policy or domestic policy, I believe the Muslim Brotherhood would have approached power much more cautiously and governed much more cautiously. Why didn't Washington do that? Why did Washington really rush in many respects to engage in a very friendly and unconditional manner, sending trade delegations, sending an NSC official, the Muslim Brotherhood? It's because there was an idea in Washington the Muslim Brotherhood was a moderate organization, that it was an organization that had embraced democratic procedures, because it had participated in elections, after all, under the Mubarak government, and because the Muslim Brotherhood had renounced violence in the 1970s. To that, I'll simply say that analysis privileged the Brotherhood's tactics during a very specific period of time over its core ideology, which was pursuing power so that it could resist the West. That has never changed. That has never changed at all. And, of course, when the Brotherhood was in power, through its power grabs, through its alienation of the society, through its aimlessness, it demonstrated quite clearly that it was not, in fact, a moderate organization. For me, the broad policy takeaway is that, if Washington can't get an 80-year-old organization right, an organization that has a website, that has YouTube videos, that is, up until recently, relatively easy to meet its officials in Cairo or elsewhere in Egypt, or even, frankly, beyond, if it can't get that right, how does it get right 160 militias that emerged in the last 5 years in Syria? How does it pick the moderates elsewhere? The experience that I observed with U.S. policy towards Egypt and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood makes me deeply skeptical that that's possible. It makes me deeply skeptical that we're really able to see things that are frankly right in front of our eyes, and makes me worry that we tend to rush towards the shiny new thing without just peeking a little bit under the hood. Anyway, I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Nancy? Thanks.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. I wanted to speak briefly about some of the on-the-ground experiences that I had, and also why I'm such an enthusiastic supporter of Eric's book, because they're really directly related to my experiences on the ground and talking to him from there. So I am an Egyptian American. I'm Egyptian by blood, American by birth and nationality. And I've been a journalist, and I'd covered the Iraq War for years, and national security after that at the Pentagon. But I'd never known a story intimately until I covered Egypt. And I remember I was in Washington when the protests started in the streets. And it was the first time that I had really seen a difference in terms of what was being said about Egypt and the Egypt that I knew. Because Egyptians at the time, I think, in Western press were painted as monolithically, that all Egyptians wanted Mubarak to go, that all Egyptians wanted a revolution. Well, I know in my family we can't agree on what day of the week it is, so the idea that 92 million of us agreed on anything was just, I couldn't understand it. And so during the 18 days while Eric was on the ground, I was calling relatives. Are you down in Tahrir Square? No, man, we're looting. Okay. Are you in Tahrir Square? No, man, we're beating up looters. Okay. Are you in Tahrir Square? No, we're at home. We're getting fat. Do you want Mubarak to go? these kids, give it 6 months, let's do a transition. Okay. Are you in Tahrir Square? No, we're crying over the prospect of Mubarak resigning. And I point that out to say that by painting Egyptians monolithically, it really ill-prepared readers and watchers for the instability that came about. Because actually Egyptians didn't agree on the way ahead. There was a big, enthusiastic crowd that agreed that Mubarak must go, but that was all they agreed on. And if anybody had a vision, however ill-conceived in execution, it was the Muslim Brotherhood. They had thought about governance in a way that some of these youth parties had not. And so that was sort of the tone at which I came to Egypt, because I really wanted to get in and cover it, because this is a country I knew and a people I knew, and I could always find a relative somewhere to give me some perspective. And so I arrived in April 2012, and I was there for the election of Morsi and the period leading up to it. And what I saw were people who were not enthusiastic necessarily Muslim Brotherhood supporters, but saw voting for his opponent, Ahmed Shafiq, as essentially voting for the very establishment that they had sought to undo in the uprising. And so it was a vote by default, in a sense, for a lot of Egyptians. And remember that Morsi only won by 52-48. The problem is, once he went into office, he treated the election as the only moment of accountability, right? We have this in this country too. There are some presidents that only treat that election day as the only moment of accountability, and they don't have to answer to the public again for 4 years. And then there are others who see their moment of accountability as happening constantly throughout their administration. Well, with only a 52% margin from many non-enthusiastic supporters, Morsi treated his presidency as that one moment of accountability, and it didn't go well. And so we started to see changes. And again, I'm on the ground, so you're just seeing little pieces, and you're trying to put together where do they fit and what do they tell you about broader Egypt. And in November of that year, he went and grabbed the judiciary, and this was seen as a power grab, and it was the first time you could really start to see a change. And the enthusiasm was going. And there was a street that sort of felt like that they could change things. We'd gotten rid of Mubarak, we could do anything. And I'm in the ground, I'm so close that you're just seeing these little changes and you don't know what to do with them. And so I called Eric in February of 2013. I said, I don't know how, but this administration cannot last. It cannot last. Because for me, Eric, and this book is that wonderful chance to sort of take all these little things that you're seeing at that time and put them together. And he was my threader, if you will, when I was on the ground. He helped me put it together and ask questions and try to put these pieces into this bigger puzzle, because you're so close to it, you can't see it. And so we had that conversation, and then after that, we started hearing rumblings of June 30th, the one-year anniversary of his rule, and how there was going to be millions of people on the street, and people who had been once supporters of Morsi, or who said give him more time, or who said it's too early, were suddenly talking about going down into the street. And so again, you're starting to sense a change, but you don't know where it is. And on June 30th, there were millions of people in the streets, and we were there. July 3rd, I was actually with the Muslim Brothers in Rabat when Sisi announced the end of Morsi presidency, and they started shooting in the air, and they beat up male reporters around us, and we ran out of there and we went to Tahrir Square, and everybody was celebrating. And we couldn't understand why people were celebrating, because I guess I had a very American thought to it, and I think something that the administration reflect. What I saw was the undoing of the process, and I think for a lot of the Americans, and then the American policy was about protecting the process. They saw it as the undoing of a personality. And so you had then the subsequent celebration of the fall of the regime, and all of us who were sort of, I guess, American in our thinking, how do you have another election if you could undo it after 1 year because a guy is less than ideal. Now, the Egyptians would tell you he was a threat, he was going to do more damage and this, but this was sort of, I think, for me, I think the microcosm of sort of the broader policy debate. And so after that, then of course there was Rabat, and we were in Rabat for that as well. And it was the first time you started, I think, to see the opening salvo in sort of a divided Egypt, because we went in and there were shots being fired and people were literally dropping around us. And we saw an apartment complex and a gate and a man at the gate, and we said, let us in. And he said, no. I said, well, we're Egyptian. He said, I think you're Muslim Brotherhood. And he was prepared to let us die out there. That's how divided Egypt was in just a matter of weeks. And then we shamed him until he did. But so that's why we're still here. And we literally went behind the gate and listened to August 13th and the killing of hundreds of people, maybe by some estimates over 1,000. And throughout this period, I would always call Eric. And if you look at my work, or you'll see that Eric appears regularly because you're just seeing these little changes, and he was the one to help me thread it together. And I think this book is so important because so often we look at Arab Spring as beginning in December of 2010 with a man who burned himself in Tunisia, or a protest in January of 2011. But I think successful uprisings, if you argue Tunisia is one, they actually start 20 years before, where you're setting the foundation for what follows the day after the regime falls. And for me, Arab Fall is the beginning of that next 20-year period. I don't know where Egypt's going. I think we see, again, these changes that we don't know quite where they fit. But I think if we are to understand where Egypt's headed, we have to start by looking at this period, because it was a turning point. And I think Eric just does such a great job in Arab Fall of sort of explaining it, dissecting it, taking you along, and taking you into this very furtive group that is the Muslim Brotherhood, such that as you study Egypt going forward, the events that you see start to unfold don't seem as surprising as they were to me in 2011, but part of a bigger story. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Michele?
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Eric, for inviting me to join you today. I really enjoyed reading the book. It's incredibly carefully researched, and as I read it, the story really rang true to me. I recognized in it the same kind of events I had seen unfold. But you invited me here to make trouble, Eric, so here I am to give some a different perspective. And here's my perspective. I really recommend a careful reading of the book, and not just the headlines or dip in and out of it. Eric has done a really good job, I think, of contextualizing the events that took place. But I have to say I'm a little concerned that some people who might not read it as carefully, or might just, grab something here or there out of it, might construct a version of events in their minds that to me doesn't read as true. And I guess there always is a bit of a danger when you take a deep dive into a specific set of events, which you did here, Eric, that somehow the reader can come away with the impression that these are unique events, that there's something unique about what happened here. And I do think that there are commonalities between what happened in Egypt and what have happened in some other places. And I'm just going to mention three of them. Three, I think, misconceptions that you could come away with, but not if you read Eric's books carefully. You won't come away with these. But at sort of a light, just hearing about it or taking a quick look at it. One of them is that one of these misconceptions, I think, is that the behavior of the Muslim Brotherhood was unique inside of Egypt. Okay, I'll come back at this, that the Muslim Brotherhood behaved in ways that other political actors in Egypt didn't. Okay, another one is that there was something about the behavior of the Brotherhood that was uniquely Islamist. Okay, and a third one, I think, is that the U.S. government's treatment of the Brotherhood in Egypt was special or exceptional in some way. All of these, I think, are not accurate. And I'm not saying that you say these in the book, Eric, but I'm saying that in the other conversations that I hear going on around town about Egypt and all of the Brotherhood and all these things, I hear these kind of things repeated. And so, for example, to go back to the first one, was the things that the Brotherhood did, were they unique inside of Egypt? Did the Brotherhood uniquely do something to make the transition in Egypt fail? Okay, I don't think that's true. I do think the Brotherhood did many things that were wrong and objectionable. I criticized them at the time, but we have to remember also that there were many other actors inside of Egypt doing some of the same things, issuing constitutional declarations and grabbing, powers, from the judiciary or the legislature and so forth. Of course, the military, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in particular, did this repeatedly, as did the Brotherhood. And I perfectly agree that the Morsi's November 2012 seizure of powers through the Constitutional Declaration was a disaster, okay, and set the stage for much of what was to come. But I just think we need to keep this in mind. Even things like the use of thugs in politics and so forth. Sorry to say this, it's a terrible thing, and I condemn it. All the political forces in Egypt do this kind of thing. So there are a number of things that the Brotherhood did that you could walk away thinking, wow, they did these incredibly objectionable things and they made the transition fall. It's true they did them. It's true they helped to make the transition fall. They didn't. They had plenty of help from others in the Egyptian scene as well. Was the Brotherhood's behavior unique, unusual, uniquely Islamist, so forth? I mean, I'm going to read you a couple of sentences from the conclusion of the book, which I think are completely right. Eric says in the conclusion that the Brotherhood rushed to power without a coherent policy agenda. It picked fights with virtually every political institution, made enemies of almost every political force. It responded to virtually every crisis by either demanding or grabbing more power, deepening Egypt's political polarization and bringing the country to the brink of severe civil strife. I agree with all of that. I think all of that is true. But, some of my other colleagues who work on other parts of the world remind me this is not an unusual situation. In November of 2012, just shortly before, actually about 10 days before Morsi issued the Constitutional Declaration, my colleagues Tom Carruthers and Nathan Brown wrote a very interesting short little paper, really kind of warning about what was about to happen in Egypt and warning about how drawing on other experiences. For example, they discussed the African National Congress in South Africa, not an Islamist organization, as well as the AKP in Turkey, and talking about how when an organization has been in opposition for an incredibly long time and they suddenly come to power, all of these things are very likely to happen. They're likely to be unprepared, to have exactly what you described, some sort of a broad vision that has motivated them as a movement for a long time, and yet unprepared with actual workable policies and so forth. They are likely to overreach for power. They are likely to be majoritarian, to be paranoid, to make enemies among others, and so forth. So again, the Brotherhood did all of these things, but it is very common for opposition movements that suddenly come to power to have those same kind of things. Regarding the U.S. government, now, Eric, you say, I agree with what you say about how the U.S. government's engagement with Morsi and other Brotherhood leaders while Morsi was in power should have been more conditional, that it was far too unconditional. And I said and wrote these things at the time, right? So I agree with you on that. But I disagree a little bit on what was the problem there. The impression one could get from this book, you said it now, that the United States did this because it didn't understand the Brotherhood properly. It saw what it wanted to see. It saw a moderate Islamist organization and thought, okay, well, great, and thought that would be a good thing for the region and so forth. I see it a little differently. My argument with the way the United States treated the Brotherhood in power was not that it was better or different, or not better, but that it was different or more favorable somehow than the way the U.S. government treated others in power in Egypt. My argument with it was the same way that the U.S. government treated Mubarak when he was in power and treats Sisi now when he's in power. In other words, whoever's in power in Egypt, we're going to engage with them in more or less an unconditional way, and we're going to cozy up to them and make nice to them, whatever they do, however objectionable it is, and however we might even be worried that what they're doing is bad for the stability of the country. So it's not that there was something special about the way the U.S. treated the Brotherhood. It's always been the same. Okay, different Egyptian governments come and go, but the character of U.S. engagement has been more or less the same. You know, there are some minor things, and of course, the President Obama never met with Morsi. Did speak to him on the phone, but unlike President Sisi, whom he's met, and just one time, yes, Candace, one time. And so there are some gradations here, but for the most part. So I would say and then I guess the idea that again, you don't say this in the book, Eric, but I hear it in other places, and I just wouldn't want your book to be used as proof of this, that somehow, as I said, the Muslim Brotherhood is uniquely responsible for making an attempted democratic transition in Egypt fail, and that its political misdeeds and so forth somehow mean that it deserves the treatment that it's received ever since 2013. The massive human rights abuses that people in Egypt, whether it is people from the Brotherhood or indeed many others, have endured since then, the political exclusion, the being declared a terrorist group, and so forth. I think your book could be taken to support the argument that I often hear that the Egyptian military had no other option but to do what they did in July of 2013, that a military coup was necessary, that ending the democratic process was necessary, that there were no political solutions. I don't agree with that. I think there could have been political solutions. It would not have happened in a day or a week. I don't think that all the violence that took place afterwards was inevitable. And again, you never say that in the book, Eric, at all. But that's just something that I think it's important to say. Let's see. Yeah, I guess that's all. So thanks very much for inviting me to comment, Eric.
Excellent. Very good. Do you want to make any responses, or should we just go? Okay. Well, excellent. So we have a lot of stuff to discuss, and I want to thank all of our panelists for bringing up some very important issues. I'm going to take the prerogative of focusing first on a few questions, and then opening it up to everyone here. So the book is about the rise and fall of the Brotherhood. One could inverse this and do a companion book about the fall and rise of the military. And so I want to ask panelists about this. Very briefly, what can we learn to help us understand Egyptian politics? And I use that term advisedly, since there isn't really that much politics in Egypt, but what can we learn to understand about Egypt today and the government of President Sisi from the fall and then the rise of the military? What have they learned?
Great. So just one point to start this off, just commenting on something Michele said. I don't, and she said this, I don't argue in the book that the Brotherhood is solely responsible, and there's a lot of discussion about the various constitutional declarations and rejiggering of the transition process for which the military was blatantly responsible. When it comes to speaking about the military's role, though, one of the complications that makes it very different from the Brotherhood, and frankly different from any political organization in Egypt, is that it's very opaque. Researchers like us, journalists on the ground, typically have access to a handful, if that, of generals. We might meet a colonel here or there by chance. It's very opaque. And that's why developments in the military, I think, tend to catch us by surprise. Nobody, and by the way, if you speak to people in the Pentagon, they'll tell you something very similar. Nobody, or I think no one that I've ever met, which would be a lot of people on this issue, anticipated the removal of Tantawi in August 2012, officially by Morsi, and the rise of Sisi. However, to the extent that we can ascertain the military's outlook from its public statements and from its behavior, what I would interpret, and of course I'm interested in hearing my co-panelists' views on this, is that the military initially wanted to support some sort of political process that would still allow it to maintain its autonomy over its own affairs. In other words, no elected government, no civilian government could oversee its perquisites, namely its control of an important share, how important we never really know, of the Egyptian economy, and that no elected government would interfere with its internal appointments, and that no elected government could send it into war. And every time that the military seemed concerned that that might happen, it delayed the process or used some sort of legal or political maneuver to further insulate itself. I document all that in the book. It then, in August 2012, with the ousting of Tantawi, which caught everybody surprised, again, a reminder that it's very hard to know what's going on, seemed to take a back seat, seemed to accept the Muslim Brotherhood Morsi was the elected president of Egypt. The military would have its own autonomy. He would control the political sphere. And frankly, the military went along with that well past the very controversial November 2012 constitutional declaration, where the military participated with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists in writing a very theocratic constitution, and also a constitution that gave it substantial autonomy over its own affairs. It wasn't until after roughly 2 to 3 weeks of mass protests against Morsi's November 2012 edict that the military seemed to pivot a little bit. When Sisi, as I described in the book, announced that he was going to host a dialogue for what he called humanitarian conversation, in other words, some sort of national unity dialogue that he would host with the elected president of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi, and Muslim Brothers and Salafists and the non-Islamists who were protesting. And that move signaled to many Egyptians, hey, there is still an independent authority separate from the president. And as this sort of civil strife on one hand, but also constant and rising protest activity continued through the spring of 2013, the military time and again signaled in certain ways that it was separate from the president. And my own view is that even after the June 30th protests, the military, and Sisi in particular, tried to get Morsi to agree on some sort of political process that would prevent it from having, as it would term it, and it's fair to contest that characterization, to oust him because there were many people in the streets, and Morsi time and again, he ultimately agreed to, in some way, some sort of reopening of the Constitution. He signaled that he might appoint a new government. He said, though, that he would not hold a referendum on his presidency or new presidential elections until after parliamentary elections were held, and that's when the military stepped in. I think to answer your question directly, what we see from the military now is that after this period of trying to manage the political process to maintain its autonomy one way or another, I think we see a military that now believes that it has no choice from its own standpoint, I'm not endorsing this, but from its own standpoint, but to rule the country. And that's why we see a very deep expansion of the military's role in both the politics and the economy. And I'm not one who thinks that that's a recipe for success necessarily, but I think that ultimately that's going to be determined by whether the generals see it that way.
Okay, thank you. Michele?
Let's see. Look, I mean, it seems to me watching the behavior of, and let's talk about the military leadership, right? The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and the key figures there and so forth, because of course it's difficult to discuss the military, as a body. But look, in the beginning, they were riding the roller coaster, and I think, at every stage in the first couple of years, I saw the military leadership trying to take advantage of the situation. I mean, I think they took advantage of the protests of the 18 days in Tahrir I don't think they wanted that to happen necessarily, but once it started, and once they saw that, it wasn't going to be easy to stop without firing on demonstrators. I mean, they didn't go the way the Syrians did, right? They saw that as their way to end the Gamal Mubarak succession plan. And I think also to take down a lot of the big business people, the big crony capitalists of the Mubarak era, who had started from the military's point of view to become too powerful, but then from then on, they were trying to limit the change as much as possible, right? They did not want a revolution. They did not want a broad change to come out. So right from the very beginning, from the very first month, with the suddenly, coming forward with these constitutional amendments very, very quickly. And it was basically, I think, the SCAF and the military that prevented what could have been a more a more participatory process of designing the transition, such as took place in Tunisia, right? Tunisia had these round tables, and they went on for months and so forth to design the transition itself, what would happen, in what sequence and so forth. The Egyptians had nothing like that. The SCAF, grabbed control of things, but it was up and down. Things were very hot. They were responding to events. They were not completely in control. Now, when you say that, Eric, now that the military now believes it has no choice but to rule the country, look, I think that when it came to 2013, the SCAF and Sisi, they decided that what you said had happened. In other words, that people were fed up enough with the Brotherhood and with the whole way political parties and political actors were conducting themselves, that they, the military, could now end the democratic transition and end the political process and restore something much more like, not identical to, but more like what took place in the military era. And I think, something that I know Eric, but maybe hasn't been said explicitly, when we talk about why have people not risen up since then, I think you're absolutely right that Egyptians became tired and disillusioned with what they saw from the Brotherhood and others. Also, the repression has been like nothing Egyptians have ever experienced. The price of going out into the streets or doing anything like that has become extraordinarily high because of all these laws and so forth that have been passed. So, and then you mention, I think you did mention, I do think all along here economic interests and the need of the military to protect, yes, from their point of view, the stability and security of the country, but also the extensive economic interests of the military, which have grown enormously since 2013. Okay, this is a major motivating factor.
Thank you. Nancy?
I would just add, remember that before Arab Spring, the military was one of the few institutions that were sort of universally revered by the Egyptian public. And it was the military that really decided, I don't want to offend anybody who's part of Arab Spring, but the military was a key part in the outcome of those 18 days. You could actually physically see it when the turrets start turning away from the population of the protesters. They determined that Mubarak would fall as much as those protesters did. And up until then, the military had all the power, but none of the responsibility. Sort of like when I write a story and I can blame my editor if there's a mistake, okay? And now the editor's gone. That's what's happened with the end of Mubarak and before that Sadat and before that Nasser, because you always had a facade that took the responsibility as a sort of secretive, underground, influential organization that was universally revered. The Egyptian military operated. And now they're at the fore. So the rise is in responsibility and not necessarily in power, because I think that power has always existed there. It's just now the responsibility with which they must take it, and you don't have that civilian who had military experience who could be that conduit between the military and governance. And I think the way you're seeing that reflected in today's Egypt is these crackdowns, because they approach it like a military does. They're not they don't govern. They're military. And how does a military respond to a threat? they don't have a political process, they jail. And so you're seeing, I mean, when we talk about the jailing of Egyptians, I don't know if I can properly articulate it. Youth centers are shut down because of the possibility that those youth could gather and uprise again. You don't know when you're going to be arrested. People are grabbed on the streets all the time. People are disappearing on the streets all the time. And I would also just add, I think the biggest change that the military has seen in terms of not only a more public face, but now an open challenge from the population and from other civilian institutions like the police, in which you see this battle playing out between police and military. So to your question, it's a rise in responsibility. And as someone who has an editor, I'm not sure that they're always enthusiastic about it.
Okay, thank you. Michele, you mentioned in passing the word personality. And I wanted to just ask a brief question about personalities. Of course, Mohamed Morsi was the spare tire. By chance became the Muslim Brotherhood candidate. Would it have been any different? Can we look back and say, well, this story would not have had the fall if Khalid Shatter or somebody with a bit more sophistication, savvy, understanding, guile had been elected president of Egypt? Nancy, what do you think?
Well, that's a great question. Because I've interviewed Morsi, and I wouldn't say that political savvy is at the top of his skill set. Remember, he was the enforcer of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's not the charmer, right? If your job is the enforcer, you see the world in black and white. I don't know the answer to that because I think the Muslim Brotherhood is so much bigger than one person. And I think what was going on in that year, again, was just a lack of sort of organizational sophistication about how to govern in such a way. As long as you believe that you had total power on a very small margin of victory, the outcome, I think, in some ways was inevitable. Remember that the military, the idea of saluting a Muslim brother, these were cultural things that just shocked the system. And so I think Khalid, we would have had arguably more charisma because, in his speech, Morsi, I know these things sound small, but it's the difference between, it's lyrical versus not, it's capturing an audience versus not. I do think, though, the outcome would have been the same because Morsi's rule was not just Morsi's, but part of an institution. And then we just sort of argue about timing. I think the only difference where it might have made it is in that period between June 30th of 2013 and July 3rd, when there were, I'm not a politician, but there were signals going off everywhere. If you just negotiate a little bit, you can hold on to power. And Morsi was obstinate. Maybe Khalid Shatter would not have been.
Michele, view?
Yeah, I agree. It's a great question. Look, Khalid Shatter, unlike Morsi, was seen more as the brains of the organization, as the strategist. He was a big and successful businessman and much more politically sophisticated and so forth. I've also heard that in their internal deliberations that Khalid Shatter was behind or was the one who pushed for a lot of the decisions that the Brotherhood made that I think were wrong decisions, right? So I don't know, he wasn't necessarily against the course that Morsi took, right? So I don't know how different, I think he would have been more clever about how he managed things, but it's hard to say. And I agree with Nancy that there were other underlying things going on. You mentioned, Nancy, the difficulty of the military officers to salute Morsi and so forth. Another thing that I heard a lot about was the tremendous tension between between Morsi and the ministers in his government that were from the Brotherhood and the ministries, the bureaucracy, right? The massive 7 million strong bureaucracy, right? So there was this tremendous fear about, Ikhwanat al-Dawla, that they were going to brotherhoodize the state and bring in tremendous numbers of people. But in reality, and in this very short period in which Morsi was in power, they didn't bring in that many people. They brought in a few advisors to each minister and so forth, as everybody does. So, and I heard stories. One person in the Morsi government actually described to me the daily skirmishes between the ministers and their bureaucracies as being like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. I mean, he said it's ridiculous. You can't get anything done. There's total resistance from the bureaucracy. Now, again, I would argue that may or may not have anything to do with the fact that it was the Brotherhood in power. I mean, maybe if it had been liberals in power, it would have been the same thing. You know, we're certainly seeing that in Tunisia, for example, to a lesser extent, but it's their bureaucracy resisting. But that was another factor, I think, that led to this look of the Brotherhood just not being able to get anything done.
Just to pick up on that, my sense from my research in Egypt and probably a similar set of conversations was that there was a difference in terms of how people within the state responded to Morsi and the Brotherhood pre-November 2012 Constitutional Declaration and post. That prior to that, because Morsi had some electoral legitimacy, people within the state, especially within these kind of ministries and bureaucracies, were more willing to go along with him. And then as basically an uprising emerged against him after November 2012, they no longer felt they had to. They increasingly felt they had another option. I can't prove that. In the intro to this book, I'm very cautious in the way that I speak about what was happening in the state because, again, like the military, it's opaque. We really can't know, and it's impossible to disprove the argument that the Muslim Brotherhood makes quite frequently that they were undermined from day one. To answer the question about Morsi versus Shatter, I had the opportunity to interview both during the course of my research. I saw Morsi in August 2010. I saw Shatter shortly after he was released from prison in March of 2011. And the difference is exactly as Nancy and Michele have described. One was very much a functionary, an internal enforcer. The other was someone with much more charisma, spoke in full paragraphs, commanded respect in part because he had spent roughly 12 years in prison and so had that sort of internal legitimacy, whereas Morsi had spent roughly 6 months in prison. But at the same time, when we think about pivotal moments, I tend to agree with what was said, that these two guys fell on exactly the same page. And the episode that I'd like to recount that's mentioned in the book is in kind of late June 2013, as the June 30th protests were really starting to gain steam and Tamarud was gaining steam, U.S. officials went to see Khairat al-Shatter and urged him to urge Morsi to make some concessions. This was actually the first meeting that they'd had with Shatter since Morsi was elected, because once Morsi was elected, there was a decision taken that the U.S. should really only deal with an elected leader, shouldn't deal, with the Muslim Brotherhood. But they went to Shatter thinking that he could exert some influence, and he was adamant that if something was going to happen to Morsi, it was going to happen anyway. There was nothing he could do about it. There was no concession that could be made. According to my research, he railed against Christians. He claimed that all hell would break loose in the Sinai because people would protest a military takeover, and he just absolutely refused, much as Morsi did. So in that sense, in the pivotal moments, I don't really see a difference. Although had you had the opportunity to meet both men, very different personalities.
Okay, look, one last question for me, and I want to come back to Washington now. It's difficult to exaggerate the shift from President Obama's reference to the arc of history bending toward justice in 2011 to the fact that we now have two presidential candidates, neither of whom would get anywhere near the concept of democracy promotion as an important American foreign policy priority. So when you look at the experience of this book, and you look at the idea of democracy promotion in terms of American foreign policy, what lessons do you think future policymakers should draw? What do we do well? What do we not do so well? And is there a way that you can see that this would become an important part of American foreign policy toward Egypt in the future?
The journalist has to answer that. Oof, that's rough. I should start by saying I'm kind of not objective in the sense that because I spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Libya, I've become increasingly skeptical that any outside power can come in and create an institution within a country, that those kind of changes have to be organic and built internally. So that, keeping that in mind, that's just from me covering wars for so many years that I sort of have that bias. To me, the biggest lesson in the period that we're discussing in terms of U.S. policy is I think often people will think of these things in terms of a policy when at the time you had a real street factor, which was really important to understand how U.S. words would be interpreted. Right before June 30th, the then Ambassador Ann Patterson came out and urged Egyptians to not rise up, that they'd elected him, Morsi, and if they wanted to change him, they should change him in 4 years. To my American sensibility, that made perfect sense. But to say it to people who have just a year earlier undone a 3-decade-long dictator from their perspective on their own, the idea that they couldn't get rid of a Muslim Brotherhood guy who'd been in power for 1 year was inconceivable. And they interpreted it as a U.S. intervening, protecting Morsi. And so I think going forward, so often we hear things in Washington and they sound logical, but to be on the ground is to see things interpreted in a fundamentally different way, so much so that it changes how U.S.-Egyptian relations have moved forward since then, because everybody kind of approached the U.S. as having an agenda so fundamentally different than was intended, I think, when the ambassador spoke. So I guess the policy lesson is it's not just about the U.S. interest or the U.S. perception of them, but how those words land and that landing shaping how policy moves forward.
Okay. Michele?
Okay, so speaking of how words land, when people say democracy promotion, I think they mean a whole lot of different things at the same time. And I'm trying to let me say how I see it. And the way I think, frankly, it's always been with American governments. It changes a little bit, the emphasis from one administration to another. But here is what it is. It's not about the United States going in and creating a democracy in another country, whether by military invasion or any. And it has never been, from my point of view. The invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, the intervention in Libya, we're not motivated by a desire to spread democracy, okay? However, once you get into a situation that's broken wide open politically, and the United States is somehow part of that situation, whether because we invaded or because, like in Egypt, we're a longtime patron and deeply involved or whatever, then the question arises, so, if the United States has a role to play, what should it advocate? And our natural thing is to advocate in a situation, as I said, that's wide open politically, where something new perhaps is going to emerge, to advocate that somehow be something democratic and be inclusive and so forth. I think, for the most part, it's hard to, and what emerges is often a mess. But what else should we advocate in a situation, as I said, that's wide open? In other situations that are not wide open, right, where there is a government in power and so forth, what democracy promotion normally means is that the United States, to some limited extent, tries to persuade those in power to, be a little more open, to allow a little more political participation, to allow civil liberties and human rights and things like that, and give some very limited assistance to those in the country, civil society organizations and so forth, media, et cetera, that seek those kind of freedoms. This is what it really means. Now, I think so I again, with the whole thing that happened in Egypt, I agree with what Nancy said earlier. The United States was never in the driver's seat here. The United States was always following events that were breaking in Egypt very rapidly and with these big players in Egypt, be it the military, the Brotherhood, the youth on the streets at the time, and so forth, they were the ones who were really writing the script. And the United States was always playing catch up and trying to figure out how to play some kind of role on the margins here. I don't, expect that to really change. I kind of agree with Eric that the United States can become better at this. Eric, in the book, you talk about the episode where the American embassy in Cairo was attacked by demonstrators, and it was like the one time that the U.S. government went to Morsi, and Morsi initially said some very equivocal, unhelpful things about it publicly, and the United States government went to him and said, like, no kidding, you have to, you have to protect our embassy, and we're not, this is not going to be okay if you let. And Morsi was sort of taken aback and changed his stance and so forth. So, I think that it's true that our engagement in these situations can be much more effective.
Yeah, I mean, my basic view is that there are certain moments in which U.S. influence can shape a country's domestic politics in more inclusive ways, and I think I point to some of those in the book, where had the administration said the right thing at the right time, read the tea leaves a little better, it might have forestalled the Brotherhood's rise, forestalled some of its mistakes, overreaches, etc. in power, and Egypt might be a lot more politically inclusive today. But I don't say that very confidently. I have to be honest with you, because what I think this story is, at the end of the day, is a story of a power struggle that emerged after Mubarak was ousted, sometimes on high burn, sometimes on low burn, sometimes, sort of dormant, but one in which the Muslim Brotherhood played its cards very, very poorly. And the second reason why I'm not so confident the U.S. can get it right in terms of shaping other countries' domestic politics is because typically those who are engaged in domestic political struggles simply have higher stakes, are moving much more quickly than a bureaucracy such as ours can respond. And if that's the case, I mean, if you're going to accept sort of my skepticism about these things, I'm not saying it's a zero influence, but I think it's quite low, then it's really important to focus squarely on what the United States actually needs from certain countries, not what it wants them to be, not what it aspires for them, but what it absolutely needs. And when it comes to a country like Egypt, that actually hasn't changed very much. The United States has certain very core strategic things that it needs from Egypt: intel sharing, cooperation on counterterrorism, overflight rights, free passage to Suez Canal, Egypt's role in maintaining regional peace, including its treaty with Israel. And I think that the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood put at least some of those things at jeopardy. Now, of course, none of those things were jeopardized. The Muslim Brotherhood fell due to its own mistakes that I document in the book very, very quickly. But precisely because the Muslim Brotherhood was hostile to at least some of those things, I'm not saying we should have, or the U.S. government should have, undermined its rise to power or tried to play in Egyptian politics. I don't believe that at all. But I do think that it could have addressed the rise a little bit more skeptically, because, what we saw in that moment that Michele cited when the U.S. really read Morsi, the Riot Act, is that he responded. And it was actually the high point of U.S. policy towards Egypt. It made him and the Brotherhood slow down, take stock, and dial back what was a very tense period in the bilateral relationship that passed very, very quickly.
Michele?
Yeah. Go ahead.
A quick follow-up. Eric, the only thing, though, is that U.S. officials said to me at that time while Morsi was in power exactly what you're saying. In other words, we're getting what we need from Morsi, right? They're respecting the peace treaty. He brokered this, agreement over Gaza. We're getting the military cooperation hasn't changed, and so forth. So, how much should we get into micromanaging what's going on inside of Egypt? Will it really be helpful, and so forth? So, arguably they were following the advice that you've just given at that time.
Right. I mean, just to respond to that, I mean, what I was always told, and I heard the same things, was what I was responding with is, well, yeah, I mean, you're getting that now. Look, the book doesn't argue, and I certainly don't believe that the Muslim Brotherhood's priority in power was ceasing cooperation with the United States or breaking the peace treaty with Israel. It was not its priority. It was certainly not the first thing that it tried to do. But the Muslim Brotherhood was always very open about the fact that that would be part of its long-term plan. Even when I would interview Muslim brothers, they always had some strategy for ultimately doing that. And again, my point is not that the U.S. should have gotten entangled in Egyptian politics and interfered and forestalled its rise, any of that. My point is that once it was in power, due to internal Egyptian politics that have nothing to do with us, the U.S. government could have withheld certain types of engagement, withheld certain types of support, and made the Muslim Brotherhood give to get. The truth is it's a moot debate at this point because none of these things that some of us feared might happen happened because Egyptian politics took its course.
Okay.
I just wanted to add broadly, because I see so many young faces. You know, one of the things I think that this book is a case study in, and is and this is an increasing pattern as we've seen in foreign policy challenges since, is that 6,000-mile gap. What gets lost in that are the details that increasingly make the difference between the right decision and the wrong decision. I think for those who are thinking about going into national security or foreign policy, I think reading the details in this book and then watching how Washington responded, a lot of these details didn't reach this city in time to make that right decision. So because there's so many young people here, I think it's something to keep in mind, because these decisions really now turn on just the most finite of details that weren't even as critical 5 years ago. And the details that were missed here, it's become even more finite since. And I think this is part of that trajectory, which I found very interesting.
Okay, great. I think we've triggered quite a few comments and questions. We'll start with Bilal in the center back. And if you can identify to whom you're asking so that we can get a lot of questions in specifically.
Thank you very much. This was absolutely fascinating. But you can't really have a panel about the Middle East without a story about conspiracy. So here's your opportunity to address that. How about the regional dynamics? How about the role of the regional countries? Yes, you mentioned the internal Egyptian politics, the kind of decades of demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood, their own gaffes, maybe the role of the United States. But how about the Emirates? How about the Saudis? How about those stories that we hear about, the anti-Muslim Brotherhood coalition, those who are invested in actually not seeing, not only the Muslim Brotherhood rise to power, but the Arab Spring actually fail and avoid the domino effect?
Eric, briefly, what role did third parties play, outside parties?
Look, I mean, there's no question that there were some, states in the region that saw the Brotherhood's rise favorably, particularly Qatar and Turkey, and those that saw it unfavorably, particularly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait to some extent. I addressed that very minimally in the book. I mean, I mentioned it a little bit because, the extent to which, for example, since you asked about, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the extent to which they were active in, let's say, encouraging the military to respond to the growing anti-Brotherhood sentiment during the spring of 2013 is really very much in debate. My view is that it was not pivotal. Of course, Gulf support has been pivotal to the relative emphasis stability, political stability of Egypt today, in that the $20+ billion that have been sent by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have just been essential to sustaining Egypt's economy. And I actually see the Gulf as far more pivotal today than during this period.
Okay, any...
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think it relates very closely to U.S. policy toward Egypt, because I saw a number of episodes. I mean, for example, when the United States and the IMF were trying to push Morsi toward adopting more, better economic policies and so forth. It was Qatar that stepped in with the money basically that allowed him to avoid doing that, right? So, Qatar and Turkey too, I think at the time were sort of urging Morsi in a different direction from the one in which the United States was. And U.S. officials, complained about that privately. And then the same thing happened, I think, at a much, much bigger way with the Emirates and Saudi and Kuwait and Bahrain to a smaller extent, but coming in, and I'm sure you're aware of the stories of basically helping to plan the coup and to fund it in advance, as well as, rumors, at least, being very involved in kind of the anti-American public campaign that accompanied the coup, which, had not really been a feature in 2011. So, as a friend of mine, who was there said, looking at the extremely high production values of the anti-Ann Patterson and anti-Obama posters, these are not the hand-lettered signs of yore. There's a lot, behind this. So I do think these, and oil prices, right? I mean, there were, the Gulf states at that time were flush with oil revenues and able to put tens of billions, behind Sisi, and it's really interesting. And the big money came in the year between the coup and the time he became president.
Yes, in the back. Yes, please. There's a mic right there.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so my name is Naomi McNally, and I'm not an expert, but I must tell you that when I heard about the Brotherhood, I expected to hear about the social side, that they were, I might be wrong, that they were supported by the people, the poor people, that they had a social agenda. So I think we heard basically nothing about it today, and I lack it. That's one reason I came here.
Okay.
And that's
and I know that Nancy has to evidently run at 1:50, so I'll let you begin here.
Okay.
Rise and fall on a political level, did the Brotherhood succeed in any way in answering the needs of the people?
So the social component was an important one in terms of, as Eric had pointed out in his opening remarks, to be a Muslim brother is a very extensive process. To support them is a pretty easy one. Particularly, I spent a day in Fayoum before the election watching the Muslim Brothers social machine come out, and it's pretty extraordinary. The cooking oil that they provide, the food they provide, the meat they provide, the medical care they provide. I think one of the other misconceptions of the Brotherhood is these are all uneducated people. There are doctors and lawyers and engineers, and they come out to these neighborhoods that have been abandoned by government services. What's interesting to me now is those services were so critical to Egypt, and you're now starting to see food trucks, government food trucks, go through Cairo, parts of Cairo, as the Egyptian pound has fallen and hunger is a real issue, replicating the social programs that the Brotherhood has put in place in an effort to keep the streets from rising up again. And so that social component was a big deal. I think it was that it was providing people services, their government did it, and saying that it was the name and the religion that they loved that to do it, rather than as a government service that made them so appealing. But so I think half of my time in Cairo was out speaking with and watching and interviewing protesters who could have never joined the Muslim Brotherhood, but saw them as part of their cause and daily life.
Is anything filling the gap now? I know that Nancy mentioned the government beginning to do this. Is there a huge social welfare gap given the closure of the Brotherhood as an effective organization?
My sense on this is that some of that gap has been filled by some of the landed interests, particularly clans in the Delta area, tribes in the south and the western part of the country. But look, what we're seeing in Egypt, especially the past few weeks, especially the past few days, is rising economic uncertainty and a sense of desperation, and certainly the evaporation of social services has to be a part of that.
Great.
One other
Michele?
little point I want to add to this.
I just want to say thank you to Nancy. Thank you, Nancy.
To Naomi's question about the social agenda, it was really interesting to watch the class aspects of all of this. I mean, while Nancy is correct that the leaders, the group of the Brotherhood that are really in the lead, yes, they're educated people and they're professionals in many cases, right? Doctors, engineers, pharmacists, etc. But they're middle class. It's not the same as the real elite of Egypt that tend to populate, especially the secular political parties and so forth, right? And so the Brotherhood really is really more a middle class movement, and it appealed to a middle class and lower middle class constituency. And of course, it's the social services and sort of the practical touch. This was the way they were able to win the elections, and everybody knew it. I mean, I remember, for example, a Muslim Brotherhood woman candidate running for parliament in Alexandria, and her entire campaign was, one thing was in the fall, they were having the election. Her entire campaign was to fill school bags with school supplies and distribute them to people at the beginning of the school year who couldn't afford to get the school supplies for their kids. That was it. There's no ideology. The action was itself her statement, right? I understand what you need, and I'm putting it in your hands. That simple, right? So there was always a lot of that type of thing. But I also want to mention the Salafis, who I think made huge headway in those years, and we can talk about why that happened and everything, but they spread around a lot of money, and they really mobilized a lot of the poorer Egyptians and surprised everyone, I think, including the Brotherhood, with the number of seats and so forth they were able to win, particularly in rural areas, and in some cases in very poor urban neighborhoods. So they actually began to compete with the Brotherhood on providing social services and gaining constituents that way.
Okay, very good. I'm going to ask Mohamed Shtatu, our visitor from Morocco. Brief question, please.
Yeah,
Take the mic.
I just, the word full, I found it a bit too strong, because recently I was in Egypt and visiting a poor area in the outskirts of Cairo called Mbaba, and I was asking people about the Ikhwan, and they said that it's a state of dormancy, that whatever the military are doing, they are playing in the hands of the Ikhwan, and the Ikhwan will come back to power. That's the belief, the strong belief in Egypt. My question is, to what extent is that true from your own point of view? Because using the word "fall" again, I think it's too strong.
Okay, so this is a great closing question. I apologize to the other questioners who want to ask. Rise, fall, will we see it rise again, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
I mean, maybe, and that's sort of how I
Going out on a limb on this one, Eric.
cautiously conclude the book. Look, and the reason for that is, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood now, I completely take your point that this is an organization of at least a few 100,000 people, out of a population of 90 million, but nonetheless not a small organization. Yes, many of them are in prison. Many of them are in exile. Perhaps 1,000 or so have been killed during the crackdown, but that would mean that you still have at least a few 100,000 that are out there. What is not out there, and what has really been dealt a very substantial blow, is the Muslim Brotherhood's nationwide hierarchy, is that command chain that is so fundamental to its ability to organize in virtually every neighborhood in the country, distribute social services, hold political campaigns, do a get-out-the-vote effort, and win power. Now, interestingly enough, Khayrat al-Shatter addressed this scenario in a speech he gave in April 2011 that the Hudson Institute very helpfully put out there. And he said that during the Nasser years, the Muslim Brotherhood's nationwide hierarchy had been completely decimated, and once the repression was lifted under Sadat, it took roughly 10 to 15 years to resurrect it, so the Muslim Brotherhood would once again be a very potent political force on the ground. That's worth considering today. A lot depends on how long the current period of repression lasts. Were it to end in the near term, it's easy to imagine that command chain resurrecting itself and it once again being a potent force. If this lasts, as it did during the Nasser period, for decades, then it's a very different situation, and it could take a while for it to resurrect itself. But of course, the book certainly doesn't argue that the Muslim Brotherhood is finished as an organization. Recall that Muslim Brotherhood organizations exist in roughly, and this is according to Muslim Brothers, 70 countries. It's still an important input in the broader ideology of Islamism, and I just don't think that's likely to change due to events in Egypt.
final comment?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Eric, and I do think too that how quickly the organization could reorganize itself would depend too on the conditions, right? Because even when the Brotherhood reemerged during Sadat and Mubarak, it was under very closely controlled conditions and so forth, as opposed to a wide open political. I think people have been pretty stunned at Ennahda in Tunisia being, very much repressed and in exile and so forth. And when there's a sudden political opening, it, was able to build this political party and organization incredibly fast, right? So, and then the big question, I think, and one that Eric and I and others have an ongoing conversation about is how will this experience of, being removed from power, having thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of their members in prison, thousands of others in exile, a period of repression that really I think is as deep or maybe even surpasses what happened under Nasser. How will that affect the organization, the ideology of the organization? I mean, one hears about, different kinds of struggles, within those who are still in the organization about what their approach should be. Should it still be a gradualist approach? Should it be a revolutionary approach? Should it be nonviolent, violent? What should it be? So this is, a real question of how this will change the organization.
Okay, excellent. So, look, please join me in first thanking Michele for participating in today's event and in congratulating Eric Trager on the Arab Fall. Really, we're delighted with its publication. Right outside those doors, there's a lovely bookseller who will happily assist you with acquiring one of these books so that you can delve into it yourself and make your own judgments. And I'm sure that when you do, you will find that this is an outstanding book. So congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.